The 1950s look safe in old photos of smiling families, shiny cars, soda fountains. But under that picture-perfect surface, daily life was filled with habits and rules that would shock us today. What felt perfectly normal back then could land you in jail now. This was a country freshly out of World War II, wrapped in post-war optimism and eager to build a future that felt steady and proud. Families moved into new houses in the suburbs, fathers worked steady jobs, and mothers were often seen as the heart of the home. Tradition and conformity were not just ideals. They were expectations. People trusted authority figures almost without question, whether it was a doctor, a teacher, or the government itself. That trust shaped the way Americans lived, worked, and even raised their children. On the surface, the era promised security and order. Communities felt close-knit, and children roamed freely through neighborhoods with little fear. Soda fountains buzzed with teenagers in poodle skirts and leather jackets. Jukeboxes played the latest rock roll hits. And every Sunday, families piled into cars to go to church. The picture was comforting. But beneath the comfort was a culture that allowed, and often encouraged, practices that today feel careless or even cruel. Regulations were almost non-existent in many areas of daily life. Cars didn't have seatbelts, cigarettes were advertised as healthy, and children worked jobs that put them in real danger. Products containing radioactive ingredients were sold in drugstores, while government-approved experiments quietly blurred the line between research and abuse. Most people didn't question it. They assumed that if something was sold on a store shelf or recommended by a professional, it had to be safe. That blind trust was a defining feature of the time, and it also opened the door to some of the most shocking practices in American history. To understand the 1950s is to understand a society that prized order over questioning and tradition over innovation. Normal life was framed by values that now feel outdated. Strict gender roles, rigid family structures, and a belief that progress came without cost. What we often remember fondly of the chrome diners, the shiny Chevrolets, the smiling families on front lawns was only half the story. The other half is harder to look at, but just as important. Because the truth is, the 1950s were not only about comfort and tradition. They were also about risk taken too lightly, voices ignored too often, and freedoms withheld from too many. The contrast between what was seen and what was hidden makes this decade both nostalgic and unsettling. It is a reminder that the past can charm us with its images, even as it unsettles us with its reality. So let's step into that world, starting with the experiments nobody asked for. Imagine being given a pill or injected with chemicals without ever agreeing to it. In the 1950s, this wasn't rare. Behind the optimism of the decade, the government and military were carrying out experiments that today would be seen as shocking abuses of power. Prisoners, orphans, and patients in state hospitals were often treated less like people and more like test subjects. They were handed drugs or exposed to treatments without their knowledge or consent. In some cases, they were told very little about what was happening to them. In others, they weren't told anything at all. To the institutions running these programs, it was framed as science. To the people living through it, it was often silent suffering. Radiation was one of the most common tools. Test groups were exposed to varying doses to see how the body would react. Some were asked to swallow radioactive tracers. Others were injected directly into their bloodstream. There were even instances where radioactive substances were placed in food, all under the label of research. The goal was usually tied to national security or the advancement of medical knowledge, but the human cost was steep. Biological testing followed a similar pattern. Substances meant for warfare or medical defense were tried on people who were in no position to refuse. The idea was that America needed to stay ahead during a tense Cold War era, but it often came at the expense of the most vulnerable. When you look back now, it's clear how blurred the line was between research and outright abuse. At the time, these programs were rarely questioned. Trust in authority was high, and the details were hidden from public view. It wasn't until years later, when stories began to surface, that outrage spread. Families discovered loved ones had been part of trials they never agreed to. Patients who thought they were receiving treatment learned they had been part of an experiment. That betrayal cut deep, leaving scars not just on individuals, but on the nation's sense of trust in medicine and government. Over time, the backlash forced change. Reforms introduced in the 1960s and 1970s placed stricter standards on human research. Consent became central. Ethical boards were created to review studies before they were allowed to proceed. What had once been standard practice was redefined as unethical and even criminal. Today, these safeguards exist because of the failures of that earlier era. The legacy still lingers. Many Americans carry a natural distrust when they hear about new medical trials or government programs. It's a caution passed down from stories of the past, when ordinary people were treated as subjects in the name of progress. The 1950s may be remembered for rock and roll and suburban dreams, but in the quiet corners of labs and hospitals, another story was unfolding, one of secrecy, risk, and lost trust. But it wasn't just labs. Even the products in your bathroom could secretly glow in the dark. Cosmetics that glowed. Toothpaste with radium. In the 1950s, radioactivity was marketed as modern magic. What we now know as a deadly hazard was once packaged as beauty, health, and even fun. Radium was the star ingredient. It found its way into face creams that promised to rejuvenate the skin, powders that claimed to restore a youthful glow, and tonics that supposedly gave people more energy. To consumers, it felt like science at their fingertips, a taste of the futuristic age they saw on television and in science fiction. Advertisements spoke of vitality and progress, not risk. The idea that something invisible and powerful could be bottled up for everyday use was thrilling. Glow-in-the-dark watches were another staple of the time. Painted with radium-based materials, they lit up brilliantly in the dark. Workers, often women, painted the watch dials by hand, instructed to use their lips to make a fine point on the brush before dipping it back into the glowing paint. They were told it was safe, but in reality, the constant exposure to radium poisoned many of them. The glowing effect was enchanting, but the cost was devastating. It wasn't only watches. Toys and novelty items carried the same eerie glow. Children marveled at the way their trinkets shined at night, never realizing the danger that came with playing in the dark. Even health products got the radioactive treatment. Some bottled waters were infused with radium, sold as energy tonics that promised to revitalize the body. People drank them daily, believing they were strengthening their health. In truth, they were swallowing poison. At the time, the long-term effects weren't widely understood, or in some cases, were deliberately ignored. Doctors began noticing cancers and strange illnesses, but companies kept selling. Regulators were slow to respond, and by the time bans were finally enforced, countless lives had been harmed. What once seemed like the cutting edge of science became one of the most chilling examples of blind trust in progress. Looking back, the story of radioactive consumer products serves as a warning. It shows how excitement for the future can sometimes eclipse basic caution. The shiny packaging, the glowing surfaces, the promises of youth and vitality, all of it distracted from the truth hiding underneath. Progress isn't always safe, and the cost of believing otherwise can last for generations. And if that wasn't alarming enough, doctors themselves sold the biggest lie of all. More doctors smoke Camels. That slogan sold millions of packs in the 1950s. It was more than just clever marketing. It was a strategy that gave cigarettes the stamp of medical approval at a time when trust in doctors was nearly absolute. Cigarette ads often featured physicians in white coats, calmly recommending one brand over another. The message was simple. If a doctor smoked it, it must be safe. Magazines, billboards, and even early television commercials repeated this image of authority, blurring the line between medicine and marketing. For many Americans, seeing a trusted figure lighting up was enough reassurance to make smoking part of daily life. The culture reflected that same acceptance. Hospitals had designated smoking lounges, waiting rooms kept ashtrays nearby, and cigarette breaks were not only tolerated but expected in many workplaces. Smoking was woven into the social fabric, seen as both sophisticated and relaxing. A puff after dinner, a cigarette during a meeting, or even a doctor lighting up while speaking with a patient was all part of the rhythm of the time. Behind the scenes, tobacco companies knew exactly what they were doing. They capitalized on the public's faith in the medical profession. By using doctors in their ads, they gave cigarettes an image of safety that research was already beginning to question. Early studies linking smoking to cancer and heart disease were quietly downplayed or dismissed. The profits were simply too large, and the cultural hold too strong. But the truth couldn't stay hidden forever. As medical evidence piled up, the public began to shift. By the 1960s, warnings became louder, and by the 1970s, lawsuits and regulations started to change the way tobacco was sold. What had once been marketed as harmless, even healthy, was now recognized as one of the most dangerous habits in American life. Today, the idea of doctors promoting cigarettes feels almost surreal. Strict bans prevent medical figures from endorsing tobacco, and cigarette advertising is limited in ways that would have been unimaginable in the 1950s. Still, the memory lingers. Old ads showing doctors with cigarettes now serve as eerie reminders of how authority can be used to sell, and how quickly trust can be exploited. They are a window into a time when a white coat was all it took to make millions believe a deadly lie. But if cigarettes didn't fix your nerves, there was always a more drastic option: brain surgery. In the 1950s, thousands of people were cured by a procedure that destroyed their minds. It was called the lobotomy, and for a time, it was hailed as a miracle. Doctors promised relief from depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, and countless other mental health struggles. Families desperate for answers believed them. What they received instead was a lifetime of loss. The lobotomy was a simple but brutal procedure. By severing connections in the brain's frontal lobe, surgeons believed they could quiet emotional disturbances. Patients often left the operating room calmer, more subdued, and less troubled on the surface. That made the treatment seem effective, at least to outsiders. But the reality was far more tragic. Many patients lost parts of themselves they could never regain. Their personalities dulled, their memories faded, and their ability to think clearly was often gone forever. For some, the damage was so severe that they could no longer care for themselves. Institutions became permanent homes, not places of temporary treatment. Others lived on in a shadow of who they once were, unable to connect with loved ones in the same way. Stories from families tell of siblings, parents, or children who returned from surgery unrecognizable in spirit, even if their bodies remained. The most disturbing truth was how casually lobotomies were sometimes prescribed. They were used not just for severe mental illness, but as a way to control behavior that society deemed difficult. Women who didn't conform, young people who acted out, or patients considered troublesome could be recommended for the procedure. It was less about healing and more about managing people in ways that kept them quiet. At the time, the medical community and the public praised lobotomies as cutting-edge science. Headlines described them as breakthroughs. But as the years passed and the long-term consequences became impossible to ignore, the tone shifted. Outcry grew and better treatments emerged, safer medications, new forms of therapy, and a more compassionate understanding of mental health. What was once seen as progress is now remembered as one of the darkest chapters in psychiatry. Today, The lobotomy stands as a reminder of how quickly society can accept harmful practices when they are presented as solutions. It is a warning about the dangers of blind trust in authority and the cost of silencing those who cannot speak for themselves. But the 1950s weren't just about medicine. They shaped careers and futures in ways we find shocking today. A job listing in 1955 didn't just ask for skills. It asked for your gender and sometimes even your marital status. To look at the classifieds of the time is to step into a world where opportunities were divided before anyone walked through the door. Newspapers carried two sets of columns: help wanted male and help wanted female. Men were directed toward careers in business, science, engineering, or the trades. Women were funneled into secretarial work, nursing, or teaching. The divide was sharp, and it wasn't about talent or ambition. It was about fulfilling roles society had already chosen. The discrimination didn't stop there. Many employers enforced what were known as marriage bars, policies requiring women to resign from their jobs once they married. In fields like teaching, clerical work, and even some government offices, it was widely accepted that a woman's professional life ended at the altar. A married woman, the logic went, belonged at home raising children, not in the workplace. For countless women, that meant choosing between career and family, a decision men rarely faced. This practice reinforced the image of men as breadwinners and women as dependents. A man's paycheck was viewed as a household necessity, while a woman's income was seen as extra, even if her family relied on it. Ambition often collided with expectation, and women who dreamed of more were told that their place was elsewhere. The message was clear: talent mattered less than tradition. For many women, doors closed before they ever opened. Professional tracks in law, medicine, and business were rarely accessible, no matter how qualified they were. Instead, women who pursued work outside the home were often funneled into positions where they earned less, advanced slower, and faced constant reminders that they were stepping out of line. It wasn't until the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that these practices were officially outlawed. And even then, change came slowly. The legacy of those restrictions lingers today in conversations about workplace equality, wage gaps, and the roles women are still expected to fill. While the 1950s painted a portrait of stability and order, beneath the surface was a system designed to hold half the population back. The story of work in the 1950s isn't just about paychecks. It's about power, identity, and the struggle for fairness that would shape generations to come. And while adults face discrimination at work, kids face something else at work itself. Before dawn, children delivered papers, worked farms, even ran machines. Childhood wasn't always about school. In the 1950s, work was woven into everyday life for kids. And many families saw it not as exploitation, but as a rite of passage. Newspaper routes were among the most common jobs. Boys pedaled through neighborhoods before sunrise, tossing papers on the porches in the dark and cold. For many, it was their first taste of responsibility, but also of exhaustion. Farms relied heavily on children as well, especially in rural communities. Sons and daughters fed animals, hauled water, harvested crops, and often skipped classes when the fields demanded extra hands. Even in towns and cities, it wasn't unusual to find children helping run family shops or assisting in small factories. For parents, this work was framed as character building. It taught discipline, built toughness, and kept kids busy. Families struggling financially also depended on the extra income. And in many cases, children were expected to carry their share of the load. A child's paycheck, even if small, could make the difference in paying bills or putting food on the table. In that way, childhood labor was often normalized as part of contributing to the household. But the conditions weren't always safe. Children sometimes worked long hours around sharp tools, heavy equipment, or hazardous chemicals. Factories offered little protection for young workers, and farms could be just as dangerous. Accidents happened, and while federal child labor laws technically existed, enforcement was uneven at best. Rural areas, in particular, often slipped through the cracks, and local businesses didn't always see reason to follow rules that few checked. As the decade wore on, the nation began to shift its priorities. Education gained more attention, and school attendance became more strictly enforced. With that shift came a recognition that children belonged in classrooms more than in fields or workshops. Over time, stricter laws and cultural changes reduced child labor, reframing it not as character building, but as unfair and unsafe. Looking back now, the stories of children working in the 1950s carry a complicated mix of nostalgia and unease. There's pride in the hard work and resilience, but also sadness at what was lost: play, rest, and carefree years that should have been protected. What was once considered normal now looks like exploitation through modern eyes. And when kids weren't working, they sometimes hit the road with a stranger. Hitchhiking was the ultimate symbol of freedom in the 1950s, but it came at a price. With nothing more than a raised thumb and a hopeful smile, young people could travel from one town to another, relying on the kindness of strangers. For teenagers, college students, and servicemen trying to get home, it was cheap, convenient. And in those days, it was considered safe. The open road had its own charm. Soldiers in uniform often hitched rides across states, and drivers saw it as their patriotic duty to pick them up. Students relied on it to get to class or to visit family. Young adventurers thumbed their way to new towns, meeting people along the way. Hitchhiking wasn't just transportation. It was a shared understanding, a culture of trust that strangers would help each other. At the time, few worried about danger. Stories of violence or crime were rare in the public eye, and most families thought nothing of letting their sons or daughters accept a ride. To many, it represented the spirit of America itself: freedom, opportunity, and movement without barriers. The country's roads stretched endlessly ahead, and hitchhiking gave ordinary people access to them. But that trust didn't last. By the late 1950s and into the 1960s, incidents began to surface that told a darker story. Cases of robberies, assaults, and even murders began to appear in newspapers. Parents who once encouraged the practice now warned their children against it. The image of hitchhiking shifted from patriotic to dangerous almost overnight. As fear grew, laws followed. Some states restricted the practice, warning both drivers and hitchhikers of the risks. Police discouraged it, and public service announcements painted it as reckless. The cultural shift was just as sharp as the legal one. Where a hitchhiker had once been seen as a traveler or a student, they now carried an air of suspicion. The roadside thumb, once a symbol of freedom, came to represent risk and vulnerability. Today, hitchhiking is largely discouraged and, in many areas, outright illegal. Ride-sharing apps and buses have replaced the practice, but even so, the memory of hitchhiking lingers as a relic of a more trusting age. For some, it's remembered fondly as a part of youth and adventure. For others, it's a reminder of how quickly innocence can give way to fear. And the risks didn't end on the road they were waiting for right at home. The 1950s promised comfort and tradition, but hid dangers in plain sight. Behind the smiling families and tidy neighborhoods were practices that, to modern eyes, seemed shocking. Burning trash in the backyard, washing a child's mouth with soap, censoring books, and enforcing racial segregation, all of it was considered normal at the time. These habits weren't seen as cruel or reckless. They were just part of the rhythm of daily life. Parents didn't question discipline passed down from their own childhoods. Communities thought little of throwing garbage into a fire pit. Librarians and school boards believed they were protecting values when they pulled certain books from shelves. And in many parts of the country, segregation wasn't just tolerated, it was the law. The danger, the harm, and the injustice were often invisible to those who lived inside the system. Looking back now, it's clear how much has changed. What once passed as ordinary is now seen as harmful, unsafe, or outright illegal. The casual acceptance of radiation in consumer goods, children working long hours, or doctors selling cigarettes, these are stories that remind us how far society has come in just a few generations. Progress was slow, sometimes painful, but it reshaped the nation into something safer, fairer, and more aware. At the heart of it all was trust. The 1950s were defined by a culture of blind faith in authority, faith in doctors, in products, in tradition, and in laws that didn't always protect everyone equally. Today, that trust has been replaced by caution. We ask more questions. We demand proof. We look for fairness. It doesn't mean the world is perfect, but it means we're more alert to the costs of calling something normal. Still, nostalgia lingers. People remember the ice cream shops, the chrome diners, the neighborhoods where kids roamed until dark. There's a longing for simplicity, even as we acknowledge the flaws. The challenge is finding balance, holding on to the sense of connection and community, while letting go of the dangers and inequalities that once hid beneath the surface. The story of the 1950s is not just about what was lost. It's about resilience and change. It's about a society learning, often the hard way, that progress and safety must walk hand in hand. The past can charm us, it can warn us, and most of all, it can teach us. Which of these 1950s normals surprised you most? Share your thoughts in the comments below.